Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and this video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous 12 hours. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And the topic number one is the talks that currently are going to take place on the territory of Istanbul in Turkey. But to discuss these possible talks, because according to several sources there are going to be no talks today, we need to understand what happened yesterday in the evening on the 15th of May of 2025. And first let's start with Ukraine, with Zelensky. He made lots of very interesting statements. I'm waiting for who will arrive from Russia, then I will determine what steps Ukraine needs to take. Zelensky on preparations for the talks in Istanbul. So later we got additional statements and this statement allowed us to understand what exactly Zelensky was talking about. Zelensky will decide whether to negotiate with the Russian Federation or not with the Russian delegation if Putin is not there. So according to him, if Putin does not personally take part in the meeting in Turkey tomorrow, there will be no point in it, in negotiations. So this is the main point of Ukrainian side. And right after all these statements that were made by the Ukrainian authorities, we start receiving very interesting updates and details from Moscow. According to information we have, yesterday in the evening, Putin held a large meeting on negotiations. And in addition to the members of the negotiating delegation, Lavrov, Belousov, Zolotov, Shoigu, Gerasimov, Arbotnikov, as well as the commanders of the troops ground in the special military operation zone, participated in the meeting. And most likely during this meeting, the Russian side probably marked questions that they want to discuss tomorrow, so today, on the 15th of May of 2025, with the Ukrainian delegation in Istanbul. And later we got the list of Russian negotiation delegation, the composition of the delegation of the Russian Federation for negotiations with Ukraine. So we have a lot of people, as you can see, but the most important thing that I would like to point your attention is their positions. First of all, according to information we have, the Russian delegation will be represented by aide to the President of the Russian Federation, Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Chief of the Main Directorate of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, Deputy Minister of Defense, First Deputy Chief of Information of the Directorate of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, Deputy Head of the Presidential Directorate. So as you can see, a Russian delegation will be represented by deputy ministers, or probably these Russian delegation will be not represented by higher rank officials of the Russian Federation. We will not see Lavrov, we will not see Ushakov itself, and of course we will not see the President Putin. We will see just deputy ministers, deputy heads, a chief of the main directorate, and many other positions, but not the ministers. And as for the 15th of May of 2025, this morning we began receiving lots of updates from Istanbul itself. And the most important information we got is the composition of the Ukrainian delegation at the talks is in Istanbul. And this composition has become known. And this is the list of representatives of Ukraine. According to information we have, Ukraine will be represented by the head of the presidential office, Andriy Yermak, and I'll remind you that this is the second person in Ukraine. Ukrainian delegation will be represented by Defense Minister Rustam Umerov, this is another very high representative of Ukraine, by Foreign Minister Andrei Sigbyha, and by Presidential Advisor Igor Zhovka. So as you can see, Ukrainian delegation will be represented at the highest levels. And this is the most important thing, and this is the most important difference that we need to understand. And this is the most important reason why there are going to be no talks today on the 15th of May of 2025. And the reason is simple: completely different level of delegations. Ukrainian delegation is represented by ministers, Russian delegation is represented by deputy ministers. So basically, when these two teams are going to be in the same office, in the same cabinet, and as soon as they take a look at each other's eyes, they will not have anything common to talk about. They will not understand what to talk about because they have completely different levels. And most likely Zelensky is going to use this situation to quit the entire negotiation process and to return back to Kiev. As for now, we know for sure that Zelensky is already in Ankara, and currently Zelensky has a meeting with the president of Turkey, Erdogan. According to information we have, their meeting is going to be finished or is going to be started somewhere at 2 p.m. of, let's say, Turkey time, and right after these talks, right after these negotiations between Ukrainian and Turkish presidents, probably, and at least the talks in Istanbul are planned. We don't know for sure whether these talks are going to happen or not. But once again, according to the level of delegations, we believe that these talks are not going to happen. Furthermore, according to information we have and according to Ukrainian resources, Vladimir Zelensky and his team do not plan to conduct any negotiations as they received orders from European creators to disrupt the settlement process as much as possible and to drag Trump into it. Another important thing that according to the Wall Street Journal, the Ukrainian delegation intends to discuss only one point with the Russian side today: the introduction of a 30-day ceasefire and the mechanism for monitoring it. This was reported by Ukraine officials to the Wall Street Journal. So once again, most likely today we're going to see no talks between between the Russian Federation and Ukraine, and the main reason of this is completely different level of delegations. Ukraine is represented by the ministers, the Russian delegation is represented by the deputies. But we need to understand one important thing, that Russia decided to represent their delegation with deputies not because the Russians are not interested in talks. We need to understand this. The Russian delegation is represented by deputies because of one reason. The Russians are going and have already arrived on the territory of Istanbul with the purpose to work with papers, to work with the settlement agreement, because all these deputies have enough of knowledge, enough of experience, and enough of everything to work with papers, to work with the final document of a peaceful settlement that in the future would be signed by the president of Ukraine and the president of the Russian Federation. So Russia sent professionals and experts who are able to work with the document, with the contract, with the peaceful settlement document. When talking about Ukrainian delegation, they sent minister who can talk, who can probably discuss just some clouds, something that is not relevant to the situation sometimes on the ground. And once again, according to information we have, Zelensky is going to talk just about one question: the introduction of a 30-day ceasefire. And according to the Russian delegation, they're going to discuss real settlement of the conflict. So this is the difference and this is the situation. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to happen. But before I started making this video, no talks began. Now let's discuss the situation on the ground. And first let's talk about the South Donetsk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. Several pro-Russian resources reported that the armored forces of the Russian Federation managed to improve their positions to the north of the settlement of Shevchenka. But the problem is that the Russians reached the next defense belt. We're talking about anti-tank ditches and we are talking about dragon teeth. It's going to be very difficult for the Russians to move further in the northern direction due to these barriers. Basically, the Russians maintain their lines and took everything under control that is located below these ditches and below these anti-tank dragon teeth. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the settlement of Bogatyri. According to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the southern part of the settlement. I'll remind that according to unconfirmed reports, the Russians by the morning of the 15th of May of 2025 were controlling around 60 or even more percent of the settlement. But as for geolocations and real proofs, the Russians control just 15 or maybe 10 or 15%. And today we had geolocation that confirmed Russian control over the southern part of the settlement. Based on this video, we have adjusted the map and we have colored this part of the settlement of Bogatyri in the Russian favor. So this is the situation. As we can see, there are still Ukrainians in the northwestern part of the settlement, and that there are still very heavy clashes between the Russians and the Ukrainians. When talking about the Dnipro direction, as you can see, we haven't received anything, and we haven't been receiving anything for a very long period of time. And the main reason, as we discussed, is anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth that were established from the settlement of Moravka in the southern directions toward the settlement of Novoukrayinka. Basically, the Russians don't have technical solutions how to move further in the western direction and how to cross these trenches and these barriers. The Russians can try doing this, but obviously they will suffer losses, and the only way how the Russians can do is using just reconnaissance and sabotage groups. To clear this territory, the Russians first of all need to deploy their engineering equipment, but as for this front line, currently we understand that it is impossible, because as soon as the Ukrainians discover the presence of Russian engineering equipment in this area, obviously this engineering equipment would be destroyed immediately. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the southern flank of the city of Pokrovsk, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the vicinity of Mirolubovka. This information was confirmed by neutral mappers. So this is the situation on the ground. According to them, additional, let's say, square was taken by the Russians. We're talking about farms in the northern part of the settlement. Furthermore, the Russians continue advancing in the area of the village of Mirolubovka, and according to several sources, the Russians managed to improve their positions in the northern direction. As you can see, the Russians currently are trying to move in the northern direction between these two anti-tank ditches and Dragon Tees. So we see that the Russians took under control the central part of Mirolubovka, and now they're advancing along this defense belt in the northern direction towards the village by the name of Shevchenka Pershe. So the Russians can do this because to the west of this road and one anti-tank ditches, to the left of this road another anti-tank ditches, and we also can see another barriers that Ukrainians established. So this is the only way how the Russians can move through every single stronghold along this tree line in the northern direction, and this is exactly what the Russians are trying to do right now. Of course, the Russians will continue moving further in the western direction towards the village of Mirne. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Kleban-Byk pocket. The Russians during the previous 24 hours also improved their positions, and first let's talk about the settlement of Novalenovka. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians established complete control over this dense network of the fortifications. So this is the situation by the end of the 14th of May of 2025. The Russians just entered this stronghold and began assault operation, and several neutral mappers reported that by the morning of the 15th of May of 2025, the armed forces of the Russian Federation managed to take this stronghold under complete control. And the thing is, and the main problem now for the Russians is that they can't continue moving further. They can do this, but it is going to be very difficult for them. The problem is that Ukrainians have anti-tank ditches to the north, further in the northern direction, and the Ukrainians have anti-tank ditches, let's say, to the east of these Russian positions. And then Ukrainians establish a Dragon Tees line. So this is, for example, a Dragon Tees line. And we understand that the Russians, if they continue moving further in the northeastern direction, they will face huge losses, because first of all, they're going to have to find a solution how to cross these ditches and how to cross these, let's say, anti-Dragon Teeth. To do this, the Russians can first of all need to send a lot of sabotage and reconnaissance group, and first of all the Russians somehow need to cross these barriers and to take under control this stronghold, and let's say the Russians need to take under control this stronghold. If the Russians with sabotage and reconnaissance group are able to capture these two strongholds, then most likely they will be able to start sending tanks, vehicles, infantry fighting vehicles with the purpose to concentrate units here, with the purpose to attack further in the eastern and the northeastern directions. So as for now, we don't expect that the Russians are going to show huge activities here. We believe that the Russians will concentrate their activities in the western direction with the purpose to get under control Novopoltavka and all these three lines. When talking about the pockets itself, today, according to information we have, the Russians managed to take under control the biggest strongholds to the west of the settlement of Zarya, this one. I'll remind you that yesterday several pro-Russian resources and pro-Ukrainian sources published this video, where we can see how Ukrainians were FPV-droning and attacking Russian units that were attacking this company's stronghold. And today, several neutral mappers reported that as a result of Russian attacks, they indeed managed to take this stronghold under complete control. And if you take a look at this map, we're gonna see that there are no more strongholds around this area. So basically, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to take under control the most important and the most powerful stronghold in this area, and now the Russians have possibilities to begin concentration of their forces for further offensive operations in the western, southwestern, and the southeastern, eastern, and the northeastern directions. Ukrainians during the previous 24 hours most likely made several attempts to counterattack, but most likely they haven't managed manage to do anything. So the Russians control the most important position, and most likely we're going to see additional changes on the ground. And now the Ukrainians Ukrainians are at risk of being encircled by the Russians, and we expect that now these pockets to the south of this stronghold would collapse very fast, because Ukrainians, if they stay in this pocket for another day or two, there are very high chances they would be caught in cauldron completely without any chances for evacuation. And when talking about this pocket, we expect that there are several thousand of Ukrainian soldiers. When talking about the southern part, we see that this part begin collapsing. Today we got several changes on map according to different sources. The Russians began offensive operation in the direction of this complex network of the fortifications from the west and from the east. And according to information we have, the Ukrainians began retreating from this area because they understand that if they stay in this pocket for another day, most likely they would be caught by the Russians in cauldron. So we expect that during the next 24-48 hours, the Russians will maintain the lines, at least in this pocket, between the villages of Staraya Nikolaevka and the village of Sukhaya Balka. So everything to the south of this red line would be taken by the Russians, and most likely without barriers and without any problems. Furthermore, even if Ukrainians decide to fall back in the northern direction, they will face lots of problems with trenches and with different fortifications they establish behind their own main positions. Now let's move further and let's talk about the Italy's direction, where the Russians during the previous 24 hours also managed to improve their positions. According to information we have, the Russians managed to break through the lines and to take under complete control these company strongholds to the north of the city of Pokrovsk. So this dense network of the fortifications was taken by the Russians during the previous night. This is obviously very important, because now the Russians also have very strong base below their let's say feet, and now the Russians can advance further in the northern direction with the purpose to attack these mines to the west of this complex network of the fortifications. And now the Russians can advance further in the northern direction with the purpose to take under control these strongholds as well. Furthermore, the Russians managed to improve their positions to the north of Delegations. Another company stronghold was taken by the Russians. I'll remind you that these days the Russians shown us very huge activities along the Seversky Donetsk-Donbass Canal. And as a result of another offensive, as we can see, the Russians managed to cut the road R0519 physically and to take under control these trenches. This is very important, because now the Russians once again have base, and from this base the Russians can advance further. Most likely, first of all, the Russians will try to take under control this stronghold, and the Russians will try to take under control this stronghold. If the Russians are able to capture these two strongholds, then the Russians most likely will be able to resolve all possible issues and problems in this area, and without any problems the Russians would be able to continue advancing further in the city, in the direction of the city of Konstantinovka. So as you can see, the situation for the Ukrainians in this area is very critical and complicated. We see that Ukrainians are losing one stronghold after another without showing any resistance to the Russian side. It's very difficult to understand how exactly the Russians managed to find a solution, how to take every single stronghold one by one, but the most important thing, we see that Ukrainians invest lots of resources, lots of money and lots of time to prepare these trenches, these anti-tank ditches, these dragon tees, but we see that all these measures carried out by the Ukrainians in the past are not helping them right now. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Liman direction, where the Russians once again managed to improve their position significantly. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to answer the settlement of Kolodisi from the north, and the clashes for the farms has begun. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians began offensive operation with the purpose to outflank the settlement of Zelena Dolina from the south and to cut off our 26 road, and the Russians currently are trying to outflank the settlement of Redkadub also from the south with the purpose to cut the main supply line that goes between Redkadub and Karpovka. Furthermore, the Russians continue offensive operation in the direction of the settlement of Grekovka. The Russians are trying to take this village under complete control, and the Russians are trying to approach this village at least from 3 directions. So very heavy clashes for this village is ahead of us. So let's compare the map between the dates. So this is the situation, for example, by the end of the 14th of May of 2025, and this is the situation by the beginning of the 15th of May of 2025. The Russians managed to improve their positions very slowly, not so much, but they're moving slowly, step by step, in the northwestern direction. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.